Thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war. Today's webinar will focus on the historic and uneven and sometimes hostile relationship that Israel has had with a variety of Central American and South American states. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and Emory Emeritus Professor of Contemporary Middle Eastern History, Political Science, and Israel Studies. About our Center for Israel Education, we've been writing curriculum, providing sources, and engaging the public about politics, culture, history of Zionism and modern Israel. We have a special Spanish material section on our website, israeled.org. We are fortunate to have cultivated an average of 40,000 weekly viewers to the website. Content matters to a lot of people. Analysis, documents, sources, maps, and other materials for learning, for teachers, for rabbis, and for teens. Underpinning our work is the state-seeking, state-making, and state-keeping concepts that comprise modern Israel. Understanding Israel's quest and preservation for Jewish self-determination is what we convey. If you're interested in supporting us, go to the website, go to the donate page. Almost every Wednesday, we've been able to provide an understanding of Israel in the post-October 7th period. October 7th, of course, was a terrible day in Israeli and Jewish history when more than 1,200 Israelis and others were murdered, women raped, babies killed, hostages taken by Hamas. Some of those hostages have died in captivity, some have returned. Some of them are still there. Since then, Israel has sought to eliminate the external threat and the existential threat that Hamas poses, maneuvering between concern and condemnation from countries and leaders around the world, as we'll certainly hear today in the variety of reviews and commentaries that have been provided by Central American and Latin American leaders. There are 33 countries in Central and South America with 500,000 Jews across that landmass. Jewish communities may all speak Spanish or Portuguese, but their respective histories have traveled different routes. Some led by pluralistic leaders, other countries that have had dictators, and some openly anti-Semitic. Countries from Mexico south have played important roles in Jewish and in Israeli history. From perhaps the high point of Guatemala's Jorge García-Granados, casting the first UN vote in 1947 for the creation of Israel, to the low of Hezbollah bombing the Israeli embassy in 1992 and the AMIA Jewish Center in 1994 in Argentina. The 30th anniversary of that bombing is on July 18th. Chile has the largest expatriate Palestinian Arab population in the Southern Hemisphere. Today, Mexico's president-elect is a Jewish woman. Now Jewish communities face rising or renewed anti-Semitism. Colombia, Bolivia, and Belize have cut diplomatic relations with Israel since October 7. Brazil has withdrawn its ambassador, yet Argentina's president has promised to move his country's embassy to Jerusalem. So we have a variety of goings-on in Central and South America, dealing with the Jewish communities and also dealing with the various countries and their relationship with Israel. Providing us perspective on a variety of topics will be Eduardo Kohn, Carrie Filipetti, Rabbi Daniel Fainstein, and Leah Soibel. Eduardo, let's begin with you, if we might, using October 7th as a benchmark. Please give us your assessment of the state of Jewish affairs before and after the Hamas attack on Israel.
The great change, or the change that we see as different after October 7, is that in Latin America, we have something that I personally call anti-Semitism from the state, anti-Semitism from the government. Because there is a lot of increasing anti-Semitism in the United States and in Europe in the last 9 months. This is something we all know. But in Latin America, we knew the anti-Semitism from the state, from dictatorships. Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, we were used to that before October 7 because it is happening from a long time. We were used to incitement to hatred Because 10 years ago, in 2014, there was a war between Israel and Hamas. I mean, Hamas attacked Israel. Israel defended itself. It lasted 55 days. And at that moment, the president of Brazil, Lula, which is the president today, said that Israel was committing genocide. What happened in 2014 was an increasing of anti-Semitism, but not as today, in several countries that repeated what Lula said. But it was different than now. Now is anti-Semitism from the state because they are leaving the Jew hatred message. And I am talking about presidents of countries that were elected democratically. For example, maybe the most unknown before October 7th for the public is the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. Gustavo Petro has made harsh statements. He compared what's happening in Gaza, what happened in the Holocaust, that's the word he used, that Israel behaves like Nazis, that Gaza is Auschwitz. He decided to break relations with Israel, and in this moment, relations between Colombia and Israel are broken. And his incitement is daily. When it comes from government, the incitement is more dangerous because if the people that he's addressing, the Colombian people, feels that, okay, if the president is saying that, what we have here is Jews, but we can attack Jews, we can insult Jews, we can harass Jews. The same is happening, not with the same words, in Chile with President Boric. President Boric was clearly anti-Israeli, and he didn't deny it before October 7th. But after October 7th, he insisted in wording like genocide. He's one of the Latin American countries endorsing the South African request to the ICJ to declare Israel as genocidal. And of course, the leader of all these democratic elected presidents is Lula da Silva. I mean, Lula da Silva went beyond what he did in 2014 when he said that what happens in Gaza has already happened in history. And he said it was when Hitler decided to kill the Jews. It created a very difficult situation with Israel. Ambassadors are not the Brazilian in Israel and the Israeli in Brazil. The relations are not broken, but frozen. And this incitement is a new form of Jew hatred because it goes beyond the countries and beyond the presidents that are saying those things. For example, in the left in Latin America, this is something that is not new, but is new in the increasement. For example, what Lula said or Boric said or Petro said came to the left in Uruguay. And the left in Uruguay has said the same wording that what the president said. But not only that, the academia has canceled professors because they're Jewish. The left has insulted officials of the government and called them Nazis because they're Jewish. And there was no reaction in the universities and in the academia. So it goes beyond. It goes beyond the same statement. It's not new that it comes from some time ago, and anti-Semitism is in almost every country in Latin America and the countries that I have mentioned. But after October 7, my perception is incitement for hatred. And it's dangerous because in 2016, after the statements made by Lula in 2014, and repeated by the left in Uruguay, led by then President José Mujica, a Jewish businessman who lived far from Montevideo was killed in a hate crime by a teacher, a primary teacher, who said that he had received a call from Allah that he had to go to the street and kill Jews. So the danger is there. It's opened, and my perception that in this moment, this incitement will not go back. It's not going to retire and to slow down. It's going to stay and maybe to increase.
Carrie, give us your insights, please.
I agree with Eduardo when he says that this has become more of a sort of state-centered anti-Semitism than it has historically. And I think the historical context is really important. Latin America has a very deep and complicated history with Israel. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 in the United Nations, you had 13 Latin American nations voting in favor of the creation of the state. Since then, we have seen a lot of what Eduardo has described as the sort of shifting in the region, largely driven by some of the political leaders and the choices of those political leaders. It's hard to answer the question specifically before and after October 7th, because to me, there's a few other geopolitical circumstances that we should bring into the conversation that were around October 7th, but not necessarily specifically that date. First of all, the elections in the region that had taken place over the last few years. It was described by some as a, quote, pink tide from 2022 to 2023. It's probably not a great descriptor. That usually refers to countries becoming increasingly left-wing. In fact, what we're seeing in Latin America is a shift towards populism. Sometimes it's right-wing populism, as we saw with Bolsonaro in Brazil. Sometimes it's left-wing populism, as we're seeing with Lula now in Brazil, Petro in Colombia, and so on. Every Jewish person knows populism can be the root of a lot of anti-Semitism, no matter which side of the political spectrum it's on. So that rise in populism needs to be brought into the conversation. The reason we talk about a pink tide is because there were more left-wing governments that were brought in over the last few years. These are the countries that Eduardo mentioned that have turned much more antagonistic towards Israel since October 7th, which would include countries like Chile, Colombia, Honduras, Brazil, Belize. Mexico has also supported the ICJ case against Israel. And then there have been the historic sort of countries that have never really gotten along with Israel, which is obviously Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, the more entrenched dictatorship. So the electoral process is, I think, an important addition to this discussion. The second one, which I hope we'll get into in more detail, is Iran's increasing role in the region. Iran, I would not say, is the catalyst for anti-Semitism. I would say that they are taking advantage of anti-Semitism in the region. They're turning that into some violent attacks, and they're benefiting off of it. This undermines not only the Jewish community, not only Israel, but importantly, it undermines the United States. And we saw that the now late President Raisi of Iran did his first visit to Latin America in 2023. He visited Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. He established strong bilateral partnerships with each of those countries. And Iran has had a historic role in the region, to include being partially responsible. The bombing of the Jewish Community Center that you mentioned, we're now commemorating the 30th anniversary of what was at the time the single greatest loss of Jewish life in a day after the Holocaust, but before October 7th, was at the behest of Iran. It was committed by Hezbollah agents, but that was at the behest of Iran. So Iran's role in the region also has a key function here. And then lastly, Ken, you mentioned it, the demographics of the region make anti-Israel sentiment and frankly anti-Semitism a lot more palatable. There's the largest population of Palestinian and Lebanese expats outside of the Middle East. There's about 700,000. Those demographics have pushed those countries, Chile, Venezuela, et cetera, to be much more antagonistic towards Israel than some of the countries with smaller Arab populations. So I think I would say that the sort of lessons here is this is a deep history where this is sort of a continuation and expansion of pre-existing trends that's being exacerbated by the geopolitical situation. I will say I always have to add some good news here is not every country is suffering from this. We have a few countries that have either maintained their strong support for Israel or even saying things that maybe surprise people. Bukele of El Salvador is of Palestinian descent, has mentioned things positive about Israel, Paraguay, Panama, Guatemala, and now Argentina under Milei. So a lot of it really does depend on who the individual leader is as opposed to specific to the countries.
What does the term populism mean in terms of its relationship with anti-Jewish feeling?
There's good forms of populism and there's bad forms of populism. The general concept of populism being caring what the ordinary people think and wanting to make sure that they have a voice in their government is, of course, in my view, not even necessarily populist. That is central to any democracy. Populism to me is about the masses themselves becoming almost a political movement unto themselves and trying to sort of take leadership. So frankly, I think there's a lot of Nazism that was based in populism, the sort of revitalization of the individual and their contributions to the state. We see populism again on the left and the right. You see radical far right activists that will often antagonize the Jewish people because they're seen as a part of the elite. So I think this goes back to historic anti-Semitism, that model minority kind of vision of the Jewish people, this sense that Jews, no matter how much has has been done to them have been successful where they've gone. And as a result, they are part of that elite class, notwithstanding the anti-Semitism. And populists who are anti-elite therefore see Jews as antagonistic to them and potentially a threat to them over the long term.
Daniel, can you make a distinction before and after October 7th? And if not, just give us your general view about how the Mexican Jewish community has been sensitized or has reacted or has felt since October 7th?
Latin America has, as Carrie mentioned, a very prominent role in the establishment of the State of Israel. More than 30, if we take those who abstained, 35% of the votes that supported the establishment of the State of Israel were from Latin America. And people like Granados or like Fabregat from Uruguay were really leaders in Zionist, pro-Zionist, non-Jewish leaders promoting the cause of Israel. Today, I would say that we see two structural factors that help to explain the geopolitical changes that Carrie mentioned. And the first, I think it's part of the American policy. I think that, in my opinion, the American policy abandoned, in many places, Latin America. They are backyard. And in this vacuum, Iran is coming, China is very strong in different places from a geopolitical and economical point of view. And I think it's part of the lack of a clear American policy towards the world. They are reactive. They don't have a serious policy to, let's say, establish a kind of equilibrium in the region. This is a structural issue. The second issue that I would mention is there is a polarization in Latin America between different kinds of government. And you see in Brazil, when Bolsonaro was the president, he was very much pro-Israel. Now Lula, they changed completely the situation, and Latin America is a complex area with different positions. We can say that most of the Jews of Latin America are very much connected to Israel. It has to be with the educational networks that has been more central to Jewish identity and Jewish community than what happens in the States. Here we have a larger percentage of young people studying Jewish day schools. Most of them are Zionists or close to Israel. So for the Latin American Jews, the current situation of these changes in government that Eduardo describes and others create a serious concern about their safety, about their future, and it's not an easy situation. We need to take a different structural, an additional structural factor. Latin America, since the 60s, left to be a land of Jewish immigration, became a land of Jewish emigration. We have large Latin American Jewish communities in the States, in Israel, of course. From the 600,000 Jews of Latin America, 1 in 3 Latin American Jews lives outside Latin America. We have around 400,000 Jews in Latin America today. And this has to do not with anti-Semitism, but with the economic, socio-political upheaval changes that the people are looking for more stable countries to live. In Mexico, in particular, has been very interesting because Mexico has always a very good bilateral relations with Israel, but on the multilateral agenda, they vote with all the Latin American countries, most of them on the left, and this is a leftist government, and the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is in the same line. But I must mention that President López Obrador established a kind of equilibrium between the more radical factions in his own party that wanted a more active anti-Israeli policy. And he said, I want to be neutral. I don't want to add oil to the fire, when he was pressed in terms of cutting relations. And then we have the same challenge that we are seeing, for instance, in the universities in the States. Here in many universities, we have a very left-wing, radical, anti-Zionist position, in some cases also very anti-Semitic positions. But for instance, the former president of UNAM, which is the largest and most important public university in Mexico, he said very clear, I am against boycotts, academic boycotts, and especially with Israel, that has a very creative, dynamic, humanistic university world. So he was against, in spite of the pressures that students and professors put. So I think that we have a mixed situation. Latin America has been a scenario of the Middle East conflicts, as you mentioned, the cases of the Israel embassy, AMIA. There are areas in which the people who are in security said that we have people from Iran and operatives from Hezbollah in the triple frontier between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, for instance, or in other places, Venezuela. There are people coming, Iranians getting Venezuelan and Bolivian passports. So there is some concern about these security issues. And the Jews of Latin America, I would say, are very concerned about the developments. There has been a huge amount of solidarity towards Israel in most of the cases. There are marginal Jews who are in the radical left anti-Zionists, but there are really a small minority. And we are dealing with that in our educational systems, providing a better Israeli education, a better understanding of the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel.
People in Mexico or Mexico City have showed an increasing concern. How does that concern translate into action? Or is it just, they're just more worried than they used to be? Is there something, as we say in Yiddish, is there something that's tachlis, that's tachlitic?
Yes, there has been a significant increase in all the philanthropy towards Israel. I'm speaking about Adas International, or Keren HaYesod, or the Keren Kayemet, and all the organizations that support the hospitals and the needs of the people displaced from the south. There has been a very significant increase in terms of philanthropy supporting this situation. On the other hand, we have been developing some educational programs for improving the training of the teachers and for some university students. Previously, I have a meeting with colleagues from the States and Israel about what's going on, and we need to prepare much better our students for interaction in the campuses. Today, we're living in a hostile environment. We need to prepare them better, and this means improving the quality of the teachers and the quality of the Jewish experiences that we have here in our schools.
Leah, you're involved with the media. You were involved with how Israel is seen, written, perceived. Your focus has also been a lot in the non-Jewish media. Tell us what you have seen and what you've sensed and what the directions might be as we move forward.
I'm going to try to answer your question from a different perspective, from my area of expertise, which is from non-Jewish mainstream Spanish language media, as well as public opinion on the ground in Latin America. And I agree with everything that my colleagues have said in their presentations. We cannot look at Latin America as a monolithic. Public opinion is not reflective of certain governments or presidents, as is the case with Colombia right now, maybe even some cases in Brazil. We've seen a dramatic change in Argentina and Argentinian press coverage with the entry of Javier Milei. So much so that in April, the Argentine courts came out and actually blamed Iran for the 1992 Israel embassy attack, calling Hezbollah's involvement a crime against humanity, and going as far as to reach out to Pakistan and Sri Lanka. The Argentine government did so in April, asking for the arrest of Iranian Interior Minister Ahmed Vahidi, who is suspected of being a key player in the AMIA attack of 1994. So I think what we're seeing from some governments at the top is definitely concerning. But then we have to look at the offset of that, which is, as Carrie said, and I agree with her, I always like to look at the glass half full. It's not all doom and gloom when it comes to Latin America, but Hezbollah's ongoing black market, money laundering, illicit activity in the region has also been called out recently by the Argentinian press. It still remains very much a concern because as we see the increasing involvement of Hezbollah in Israel's regional war against Hamas and Iranian-backed Hezbollah, we know that Hezbollah's illicit activities on the ground in Latin America act as a fundraising component for funds that are then sent back home to Lebanon for Hezbollah to be able to carry out its military activity, not only against Israel in the Jewish state, but against Jews worldwide. So that remains very much front of center, particularly when it comes to press coverage. But I will say this from a press perspective, from a media coverage perspective, since 10/7. What we're seeing in the press coverage right now, I have to say, when we're comparing it to maybe English language coverage or coverage in other languages, what we're seeing is what we've seen before. There are outlets that are concerning, top media outlets, that their coverage is obviously very biased, and that's an editorial line that they have no intention of changing. But by and large, because of the large percentage of Latino victims, witnesses, and even hostages on October 7th, that dark day of the massacre, there is a piqued interest on behalf of global Latino media to be covering more frequently and more accurately what is actually happening with regard to Israel's war against Hamas. There's an interest per se because it is a war. It is the number one story in the world right now. It will continue to be the number one story throughout the rest of the year. So any journalist of any caliber is interested in covering what's happening on the ground right now in Israel. But the added interest of the Latino angle, I also see as an opportunity to educate millions of Latinos about hostages that remain in captivity, like the Bibas family, like the Cunho family, like the Horn families. These are all siblings that have been taken hostage on October 7th and remain in captivity. These are all hostages with Argentinian backgrounds, with Argentinian citizenships and nationalities. So that point, which I think is a very important point, and we've seen how interested the media are in covering their story time and time again, even 9 months into the war, I think is significant. And it's something that we're honing in on at Fuente Latina, so much so of producing now a documentary about the Latin American immigrant survivors and witnesses of the October 7th massacre, to be able to educate and inform millions of non-Jewish Latinos worldwide about what happened that day, but from that specific Latino perspective. Now, from the side of Israel's enemies, whether it's from the extreme right or the extreme left, the sad reality is what they've been doing prior to 10/7 is nothing different than they're doing post 10/7. They have been working to create fertile public opinion ground through disinformation, massive amounts of disinformation. As Daniel alluded, the Chinese are very active in media and Spanish language media. Iran has been at it for over 2 decades. Russia, RT, the Russians are dominating disinformation throughout the Spanish language media. And let's also not forget Qatar. Al Jazeera has been very active in Spanish and in Spanglish and trying to reach the next generation of Hispanics, particularly in the United States. And their disinformation and their propaganda is abhorrent. And the reality is what we see in English language social media, where there are now regulations being put into place to be able to take down hate speech and Holocaust and October 7th denial, those same regulations do not apply to Spanish language disinformation in social media platforms like Meta and Google. So we have an added challenge in the Spanish language press to try to counter what is an endless arsenal of disinformation that is fueling anti-Semitism, particularly amongst the younger generation in Latin America, which is now what Daniel was also saying is what we're seeing on US campuses. We're also starting to see that effect on Latin American campuses because of the younger generation consuming solely from digital and social media, which is where the enemies are specifically targeting those audiences.
Let me switch and take a look at how the individual Jewish communities, how they themselves have reacted. Are they maybe more fearful, but are they going to synagogue more often? Are they more curious about how this all unfolded? Are they reaching out to others across national borders to create sort of common interest groups?
It depends in the country. In the country where I live, in Uruguay, we didn't have to face the government because the government, this government today, is supportive. Is supportive of Israel, the right of defense, and has voted in a favorable way for Israel in all the agencies of the United Nations. But we have had strong confrontations with the left. And the left is not a question of saying the left. The left is called in Uruguay Frente Amplio. Frente Amplio is the name of a coalition of the left who can be the next government in 6 months, where there will be elections, and was government 15 years. And we have to face, and the Jewish community faced, not only the question of press releases or some statements of unions or students, but 3 examples. I don't know if we know here, but a professor of the Jewish Hebrew University, maybe Daniel knows, Alberto Spektorovsky, came to Uruguay usually once a year to give lectures about questions of sociology in the university. He was canceled by the students. The university decided, the Jewish community reacted. They were called to parliament, but they lied in parliament. I mean, the dean of that university lied. He said that they didn't cancel, it was postponed. It was a lie. Why? Because Alberto was in Uruguay until 2 days ago, and they never gave him the opportunity. They said that because he is a Zionist. An officer, the director of culture of the Ministry of Education, was attacked by another professor of other university saying that she's a Nazi. Why she's a Nazi? Because she is Jewish. The Jewish community had open doors in the media, not in leftist media, but in all the media, the real media, I mean, TV, the media that today you can do it, in the media, in the streets, in the parliament. And of course, we are confronted with the left because the left didn't open the doors. But the Jewish community was not silent, has not been silent. And it happened in other times. I'm not talking about Uruguay, I'm talking about other communities. In this moment, I feel that in general, in Latin America, there is no silence. Not with the right, not with the left, not with any government, not with attacks against the Jews. This is what I feel, that Jewish communities are not silent. And in the case of Uruguay, we have not been silent and we will not be silent. We win, we lose. This is not a question of win or lose. It's the question of facing the problems.
Daniel, something unique happened in Mexico in the last month. It elected a female president who also happens to be Jewish, or she's Jewish, and he also happens to be a woman. What does that mean for Mexican Jewry?
First of all, I think that the case of Claudia Sheinbaum is an example of something that we don't need to lose in our big picture. The history of the Jews of Latin America has been a very successful history. Jews in Latin America are very well integrated in most of the countries, in the economy, in culture, in politics, in all the fields. So it is a very successful story of integration. We need those, because sometimes we have the myth of the Nazis and the anti-Semitism. The Jews in Latin America are very much integrated in the upper middle classes, in all the fields that you may mention. That's very important. The case of Claudia Sheinbaum is an example. The Jewish issue was not an issue in Claudia Sheinbaum election. Really, there were small anti-Semitic uses of her Jewish origins against her from the radical left and from the opposition to the current party. But there are some Jews who supported her because of her political views, left-wing views, and there are other people in the community who were against her not because of her Jewishness, but because of her political views. It was not an issue at all. There are huge expectations about how she's going to govern in 2 months, when in October she will take the helm of the government. If she will differentiate herself, it's possible that there will be pressures being her Jewish women about the relation vis-a-vis Israel. The Jewish community has been very active. The central institutions have been connected, speaking with politicians, with media, with the religious groups. I think that we need to strengthen the alliances with different groups in the country that also have a strong connection with Israel, being the evangelicals, being Catholics groups, moderate Catholics groups, and other political groups that support democracy and support peace in the regions. But the community has been active. They prefer to work on a low key. That's the strategy that this local community uses usually. But they have been very active. Some people think that we need their voice in the public square. Some people say it's better to have the usual approach that it's closed doors. So this is a discussion that is happening in the community because today we're facing a nightmare scenario. And in a nightmare scenario, the best thing you can do is defending, having a wise leadership and working in a very serious and careful way to help improve the situation of the Jewish community and the connections and the cause of Israel.
Is there a generalization that would hold for how the Catholic Church has reacted to October 7th? Or that's just not a good question?
It's not that it's not a good question. I don't think it's even relevant to the non-Jewish media coverage, only with Argentinians because he's the Argentinian Pope. But beyond that, no. But I can tell you in terms of my engagement, and I've had a lot of recent engagement with all the different communities vis-a-vis their local non-Jewish media and their coverage, is that, again, every country, every community, every Jewish community has its own challenges based on the many variables, political and societal, that exist around them. And so as Daniel was saying, the community of Mexico City tends to take kind of the low-key approach. There are other approaches, like in the case of Argentina and Uruguay, that got Roger Waters kicked out of his hotels back in the day. So every community fights back and speaks up in its own way that makes sense for its own community and its own situation. Chile by far has some of the bigger challenges, and they mobilize also to try to fight back what they're experiencing. But by and large, I think that like all Jews worldwide, everybody's still kind of reeling from shock and questioning what can we do moving forward to not only better defend ourselves, but to be better prepared for what may be coming. Anecdotally, from my conversations, I've had members of the Jewish community from several countries across Latin America. Their resilience is stronger than ever. Their love for Israel is stronger than ever. But like Jews in America and Jews in Europe, we're concerned. We're very concerned by what we're seeing not only around us on TV and what we're seeing in Israel. And so it begs the question, what can we do better moving forward?
What is it that we should be doing better across the continent in terms of response? Not so much individually in a particular country, but is there something broader, something larger, something grander that the Jewish communities of Central and South America could be doing?
I think it's a great question. And I'll put it very bluntly. The anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment that we're seeing both in Latin America as well as in the United States is essentially a canary in the coal mine for a broader cultural rot that we have not just, again, in Latin America, but here in the United States as well. So I think we have a clear and targeted U.S. interest in rooting this out. I would answer this in a couple of different ways. First, as Daniel said, the United States has been doing a historically poor job of focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean over the last few years. We've essentially abandoned our strategy in Venezuela. We have some key allies, new allies like Milei, that I think there's been some of the current administration's concern in working with because of the different ideological perspectives. And I think we've really lost sight of the fact that American interests are very clear in the region, not only because of the southern border, which dominates so much of the discussion, and which, by the way, is relevant to this conversation as well, because as Iran permeates the region, some of those folks will be coming up to the United States as well, but also because ultimately we're seeing that Iran is taking advantage of, you can sort of view Latin America as a great petri dish for a nation like Iran. It is close to the United States where they can have easy access to us and sort of be a thorn in our side. There's a general sort of lack of rule of law in many of these nations, not all of them, that Iran can take advantage of. There's a lot of illicit financial networks and things like cartels and so on where they can generate a lot of income. And they have this amazing amazing pre-existing diaspora network that we already mentioned of Lebanese and Palestinian individuals who are easy targets for a lot of the spread of Iranian propaganda, Russian propaganda, and so on that Leah and others have mentioned. So the United States needs to, one, focus much more on the region and start engaging with them as partners, not as little brothers, right? They have their own ideas, they have their own momentum, and we need to be taking them seriously as we partner with them going forward. The second thing that we need to do is stop just saying things like asking them to do things, asking them to change their perspective. We need to give them an incentive to do that. And we need to make sure that we are, frankly, penalizing those nations that are saying things that aren't just anti-Israel, but are blatantly anti-Semitic, like when you compare Israel to Hitler, which has been done in Latin America since October 7th. There was a great hearing in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, with our special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, who is fantastic. And she mentioned that a lot of times all it boils down to is basically the U.S. saying, please don't do this, please don't use this language. We just need to put a little bit more action behind that. And then the last thing that I would say, and this goes back, frankly, to the Iran point, is if we're not partnering with these countries on what matters to them, which are things like reestablishing rule of law, which are things like fighting corruption, which matter to the U.S. as well, then we're going to increasingly see not just Iran, but China, Russia, and others take advantage of that, start to set up shop in order to sort of target the United States from our south. And so we have very, very clear strategic interests here. And it starts with maintaining stronger and broader relations with our partners in the region and putting more force behind our words with those who are falling into this anti-Semitic trap.
Eduardo, any final conclusions?
Following the thoughts of Daniel and of course Carrie, I know that we are very concerned about the penetration of Iran, 30 years of the AMIA bombing, the hosting of Lula in 2014 at that moment of President Ahmadinejad, et cetera, and the penetration in Bolivia and other countries. But I think that there are three penetrations in Latin America that the United States should take care of, and is not doing that. Russia and China. The Russians are not only in Venezuela and in many other countries, and many other countries are supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine, openly or not openly. And China, through business and commerce, is practically taking over all Latin America. Not one country, all Latin America. And this is something that the United States knows. And as Carrie says, we are not the little brothers or the little kids that need some toy. If we don't feel support, if a government doesn't feel support, if 10 governments doesn't feel support, they will go elsewhere. And this is very dangerous for all the population in Latin America. And my last comment is very simple, is numbers. Mexico has, I don't know, 130 or 140 million people. But it's not only Mexico. What about Brazil? Brazil is a continent in itself. We are talking about 500 million people. I mean, we are not talking about some small country. I think that's the great danger. And this is something that we feel as Latin Americans living in Latin America, that is very dangerous, agreeing with what Daniel and Carrie said.
I'll take it back up to the media level. We cannot look at these countries and assume because their leaders are anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, that the people are as well. From all the experience I have working with thousands of non-Jewish journalists in Latin America on a daily basis, they want to cover Israel. They want to get to know the Jewish community. And rather than focusing on those that know us and hate us, we should be focusing on those Latin Americans that don't know us and don't hate us, and focus on storytelling and communicating about our history, our identity, and our culture to them.
It's important to remember that what happens in Latin America will very easily happen in the United States and elsewhere, which is why we need to pay attention. When we talk about the AMIA bombing, which again, we're on the 30th anniversary, that came 2 years after the bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. But there were things that happened after. The day after the attack, there was a suicide bombing on a commuter plane, which was thought to be done by an Arab traveling under an alias, trying to kill Jews. 12 of the 21 passengers who died were Jewish. 8 days later, the Israeli embassy in London was car bombed. 13 hours later, there was another car bomb that exploded in a Jewish community center outside of London. So this is, once again, the best phrase, and we use it all the time with anti-Semitism, the canary in the coal mine. We need to be paying a lot more attention to it and rooting it out where it is among our allies and our partners. And I agree with Leah, making sure that we're boosting up the people who are our friends and making sure that we have no tolerance for the others, because this is going to come to the United States and to our other partners if we don't address it.
Yeah, I think that we are doing a good reactive job, but we need to change the chip. We need to have a more proactive, strategic view to deal with Latin America at large, together with our allies in the States, in Europe. I think that we need to change, and we are not doing that in a very strategic way in which we make a segmentation of the different populations and what we can do and how we can work. So I think that we need to be more proactive and strategic than reactive.
I think what we've learned over these 8 months now of these webinars is that Israel is not only facing a physical war of attrition, not just a single war, but it's a war of attrition because it's happening on multiple fronts for Israel. But Jews and Israelis are facing an ideological war of attrition.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's better said philosophical. I don't know which word you want to choose. And it's underlining the necessity to remind those who need to know that democratic values are under siege, pluralistic values are under siege, and we can't afford to have them recede. There are plenty of outside players, Russia, China, Iran, more or less nefarious than the next, but they continue to play when there isn't pushback. And the pushback needs to be continuous and it needs to be strategic. And if I can take Daniel's phrase, don't play as much defense, but play some offense.